I'd like to introduce our next speakers, Kate Starbird and Alexa Koenig. So Kate is assistant professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. She researches human-computer interactions in the field of crisis informatics, so how information and communication technologies are used during crisis events, a topic that's particularly close to my heart, including how rumors are spread during natural disasters and other emergencies. Alexa Koenig is executive director of the Human Rights Center and lecturer in residence at University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where she teaches classes on human rights and international criminal law. Prior to coming to Berkeley, she was program manager of the Witness to Guantanamo project, and she's currently a member of the Technology Advisory Board at the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. So we were asked to talk a little bit about ethics. I think the open source information community is at a really interesting stage of its evolution. We're seeing these methods being increasingly used by a diversity of actors. And some of that diversity actually builds our strength, whether it's diversity of geography or diversity of ethnicity or diversity of gender. Having more voices and perspectives and talents helps us to build a faith in facts that we sorely need. However, we're also seeing the spread to new disciplines. Whereas traditionally you would see the intelligence communities using many of these basic underlying techniques, journalists have, of course, helped to advance this space. And now we're also seeing lawyers and other legal actors and other fields that are realizing the utility of this work. Pretty much anyone who works in the area of fact-finding is going to find these ways of finding facts and verifying facts of interest. But we're also seeing other kinds of new actors in this space. Graham mentioned at the beginning that part of what we're doing is telling stories. I would imagine that most of us are trying to tell stories that are firmly grounded in nonfiction. But many of the newer actors here are realizing the utility of some of these methods for creating stories of fiction. And I think that becomes deeply problematic when we're trying to get a narrative out about what's happening in the world. Fiction can be very emotive and very compelling, and it really threatens to drown out these really well-based stories that people take sometimes years to actually build and develop. There are also a couple of really interesting cases that have come up in the last couple of years that have made us think about whether we do need some form of ethics to guide our decision-making about what tools we use and when. To use a classic example, crowdsourcing of information, so putting up, for example, a picture on Twitter and asking people for what they know about that image can be deeply problematic. If 5 years ago the gold standard was to blur the face of the vulnerable individual in that picture so they wouldn't ultimately be exposed to more harm than they would have if you didn't put that picture up, today, with very simple reverse image searching, we're seeing people increasingly find the original, and ultimately those baseline protections have proved futile. We're also seeing issues arise with microtasking, which is a big part of this work. Questions around when we should be using techniques that basically violate different corporate policies, practices that are arguably illegal or are illegal. And what does it mean for subterfuge if we're using sock puppets and other ways of getting at sources of information in ways that were not originally intended? There's a saying that there can be no profession without professionalism. And a big underlying core of what it means to do something professionally is to adhere to a certain code or set of standards that a community of practice agrees is the baseline for doing this work. There's also a maxim that with increased influence comes increased responsibility. So some of what I'm hoping we're going to talk about in the next 20 or so minutes is what does it mean to do this work responsibly? Kate's going to talk a little bit about why we may want to think about ethics, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what that might actually look like before we open it up to you for what's next.
All right, so as Alexa said, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think we need ethical standards and methodological standards as well. Andy introduced me earlier. I want to repeat a couple of those things. So my name is Kate Starbird. I'm an almost associate professor of human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington. For more than 10 years, I've been studying how social media are used during crisis events like natural disasters and also man-made crises like acts of terrorism and shooting events. For about 5 years, my colleagues and I have begun to focus on the spread of misinformation in this context. And since, in 2017, in part following our data, and also in part reaction to troubling global shifts that we were perceiving within our data, we shifted focus onto online disinformation and what we're calling strategic information operations. I can actually tell you that the day that shift occurred for me, the day I went from misinformation to disinformation. It was the day of the women's general strike in spring 2017 in the United States. I had just written a first paper from our lab about how conspiracy theories of crisis events were connected structurally to the Russian disinformation apparatus, and how that apparatus had been actively shaping political discourse in the United States in 2016 and leading up to that election. And in the United States and actually all over the world as well. And on the day of the strike, instead of going out with my friends, they were going to go out and take some action in the world, protest. I actually stayed home and I took that work that we'd been doing and I wrote a public-facing Medium blog or article about that. And that blog is why I'm here today. So publishing that was the moment I went from thinking about these things to trying to do something about some of the things that we'd been studying or seeing in the data. And it was the moment I became part of this community of disinformation researchers, self-deployed, a little bit out on a limb, with some institutional support, but not a lot. My institution didn't really know how to support me. And I think, like many of you here who are doing similar things. So I'm a little bit out of sorts today. I'm used to giving talks with like lots of slides and presentations and all of the data showing various different kinds of disinformation campaigns, conspiracy theories about crisis events, Russian trolls in the US political discourse in 2016, the campaign against the white helmets in Syria. But today I don't have pretty slides, and I'm not going to talk about a particular disinformation campaign. Instead, I'm going to share a few of my fears, a few of the things that keep me up at night, and maybe a recommendation or two to go along with those. This is my manifesto. It was conceived in a coffee house. I was sitting with a friend of mine, and we were talking about a mutual friend who was experiencing an information operation. She had just published a report that was commissioned by the U.S. government about Russian interference in the 2016 election. And she was experiencing a very targeted and very effective campaign that was online. It went through the media. And we were wondering, what can we do? What can we do to help her? What should we do? How do we do this? How do we not compromise ourselves as we're trying to do these things? And the answer to that conversation and that we were having, I think, is the answer to this question that we're talking about here today. And that is, why do we, as open source researchers, need ethical and methodological guidelines? And here are my thoughts on that. Because this is hard work, because this is extremely important work, because this was work that has impact on human lives, individual and collective, including people who accidentally get caught up into the kinds of things that we're studying, and because, as researchers in this space, we are vulnerable. We are now beginning to understand that the long game of disinformation is to chip away at the foundations of democratic institutions, in part by undermining our faith in information, fostering doubt and distrust. And our goal, which attempts to confront these tactics head-on, is a direct threat to that intent. We exist inside the same information space that we're investigating, and we are all targets. Disinformation works by undermining trust in institutions, in information sources, in us. If a researcher or journalist or media outlet or an NGO or a government program is a threat to a disinformation actor and its aims, in other words, if we're effective at the things that we're trying to do, then we're targets, we become targets. Disinformation works by neutralizing and delegitimizing threats like us. And the best disinformation builds on top of nuggets of truth. An honest mistake, an unfortunate association, narratives about our funding, how we're doing our work. In our space as open source researchers, mistakes are easy to make, and so are connections. And our own digital histories are long. So disinformation seizes these as opportunities and uses them to strategically to delegitimize our voices, even silence us, and undermine our work. We've all seen this in action, a colleague getting dogpiled by an army of trolls for making a mistaken claim about the authenticity or inauthenticity of an influential account. A critical report on disinformation undermined just at the right time by revelations that one of the author's colleagues, someone who claimed to be a researcher of disinformation, had run experiments using disinformation during a US political campaign. Isn't the brightest idea. The latter is what I call the associative property of disinformation. If A is associated with B, and B makes a mistake, then we can use the connection between A and B, no matter its substance, to associate A with that mistake and undermine or delegitimize A's work. So we've seen these tactics used against people in this room, against other open source researchers who aren't in this room. We've also felt the fear. I hope they don't come to me. I hope they don't come for me. What did that person do wrong? Was it wrong? I don't know. Should I say something? Should I support them? Should I condemn them? Maybe no one will notice. I'll just sneak out of those mentions and power down the old tweet deck, and I'll keep my head down and go on doing my analyses a little bit more quietly. But that's not going to work. We need to do better. No matter that this is an asymmetric battlefield and the other side aren't constrained by rules and norms, we need those rules and norms for our own safety and for the integrity of the work that we do. We need to establish an ethical code and acceptable methodological guidelines that protect the people we study, the integrity of our work, and ourselves. We need to define our community by that code and these practices. And then we need to come together and defend our community as defined by those practices. In other words, if the people that we have in this community agree to follow a certain set of guidelines and rules and practices, then we know we can come together and defend them when the time comes, when people are targeting them, when their work is beginning to hit and they become a threat to the people that might want to undermine them. This isn't necessarily an easy task. Our community is an amalgamation of many different kinds of individuals and groups with different skills and backgrounds who, for the most part, like me, self-deployed onto the scene of this informational crisis. These are academics and journalists, tech platform employees, members of various NGOs, and anonymous Twitter accounts, some of which are quite good at what they do, actually. There's a few out there that are really quite good. And there's strength in this diversity and potentially resilience. It's a good thing, but it makes us vulnerable to mistakes and to that associative property of disinformation. We live in a world where increasingly, the people gaining power are relying on disinformation and influence operations to seize and maintain that power, manipulating information spaces, spreading political rhetoric based on fears, and in-group, out-group grievances, undermining trust in information spaces. That's not fake news. They understand how to find and manipulate our vulnerabilities, and we, a community of researchers trying to hold them accountable, are vulnerable. This is why I think it's critical for us to establish an ethical code and standards of methodological practices to help us combat disinformation by building trust, building a trustworthy community of open source truth finders and truth tellers, one that we will collectively fight for. There's strength in numbers. There's strength in the numbers here and the numbers out there. We need to define the boundaries of who we are, of what are acceptable practices in this space. And for those of us who follow those practices, we need to defend each other. We cannot stand by or duck our heads when they come for another of us, because they will pick us off one by one. We have to establish a community, build trust in that community, and collectively defend that community against the same actors and tactics that we all know too well. Thank you.
So what does a potential code of ethics look like in the overlapping space among all the different disciplines that are coming together? One of my jobs at UC Berkeley is as co-founder of the Investigations Lab. The lab is a giant experimental place where we bring together approximately 80 students from across campus from close to 24 majors who collectively speak about 30 languages and dialects. And the idea with that lab is to begin to push the boundaries of how we work in different areas of practice using open source content, and what we can do when we actually begin to push ourselves out of our comfort zone and begin to explore new methods. Well, one of the uncomfortable things about leading a group of students is that they start to ask really challenging questions. And one of the first sets of questions they began to ask when they started doing this work was around the ethics that apply to what they were increasingly doing. And I began to look at what ethical codes are out there. And I realized that it's difficult to actually pull together from all the different people who are working in this space what an ethical framework might be. Journalism arguably has one of the most applicable sets of ethical guidance, and so that's one of the first to which we turned. In the open source community, a lot of times the conversation really focused on user-generated content that we were all relying on, and actually giving credit to the authors of that content. But that was arguably insufficient for what we were thinking about. We looked at legal ethics, but again, that had a very narrow application to this practice. And then third, looked at the social science research community, who also has one of the most mature and fleshed out bodies. One of the really difficult things is figuring out now how and under what circumstances do different parts of those ethical codes ultimately get pulled out and begin to give us some sort of guidance in ways that aren't ridiculous. There were a few conversations that have happened over the past year that I think have been really helpful to this. In addition to conversations within our investigations lab, we also are part of something called the Digital Verification Corps at Amnesty International, which is a global consortium of universities that are looking at building out these skill sets around open source research and open source verification. We were also part of a workshop at the University of Essex with their Human Rights Big Data and Technology program. We co-hosted with them in January a first conversation on building some kind of ethical framework. We also are building at UC Berkeley an international protocol on open source investigations. That one is particularly aimed at people who want to do fact-finding for legal practice, and particularly building war crimes dossiers and other evidentiary records for basically holding wrongdoers to account. We have 3 sets of clients in the investigations lab. One are investigative reporters and other journalists. The second one are lawyers, particularly human rights lawyers, and the third are human rights activists. So we've worked with all of the big companies in that space. In having these conversations and looking at the tensions between the ethical codes that are potentially applicable, we've come up with 3 areas where there seem to be some growing consensus that I think are worthy of further exploration. The first value that an ethical code might protect is safety, and you might also call that security. And when we're talking about safety or security, I think it's really important to think through security and safety for whom. We, of course, have the investigator and his or her team. We have the people who are providing the information and uploading it. We have the authors of that content. We have the people depicted in that content. And we have the data that we are holding onto itself. We also have to ask about what. What are we trying to hold safe and secure? And what are the risks that we're trying to protect against? At the lab, we tend to think about it in 3 buckets: physical security, digital security, and psychosocial security. And I think the third is also really underappreciated in our space. One of the things that we've really been trying to work out is a streamlined plan that gets integrated into all of our investigations plans about both ethics and psychosocial security. When we're talking about psychosocial security, a big piece of what we're all doing is looking at very large quantities of sometimes very graphic content. That gets to the best of us, and it's not a question of strength. It's a question of knowing ourselves well enough to know when we are being affected and to recognize that the risk of being impacted by this material, which we all will be, is actually putting the physical security and the digital security at risk. They all relate to each other. The second bucket that I'll briefly mention is protecting the underlying value of truth, of accuracy. So in that particular situation, how do we actually build faith that the methods we're using are being deployed in ways that can build this faith in facts? Well, the scientific community actually has some of the most advanced ways of thinking about that in their ethical codes, looking at things like having more peer review of each other's work, of having methodological transparency, which I know is a big signature of this particular area of practice, and third, having multiple working hypotheses when we're investigating different phenomena. It also means we need to have accurate training. And I think that's one of the areas where we really need to be thinking about who is part of this community. We want to encourage innovation, entrepreneurial growth, but at the same time, we don't want people stepping into areas where it does take some professional skill and ultimately putting information out there. I think we all know about what happened with the Boston bombing situation, where people were speculating about who might have been responsible, and that ultimately put people who were not responsible at risk. We also have had very recent situations where international law enforcement have posted pictures to try and get input for those pictures, and unfortunately have revealed either pieces of their investigations in ways that they hadn't anticipated, or also people who were maybe implicated in those alleged crimes. The third thing that I would say, and I think also, just one last thought on that, I think particularly as we see new methods of mis and disinformation, as we see the proliferation of the use of shallow and deep fakes, we're going to have to think about this even more aggressively. The third part that I would mention, and the third underlying value, is arguably dignity, or respect for other people. David Kaye, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Free Opinion and Expression, has argued that ethical frameworks on their own are not enough. That what we also need is an understanding of basic human rights law and how that can potentially be a guide, particularly when we're talking about the use and the creation of new technologies. This can get at issues like authorship and attribution, which was a big issue many years ago in the journalistic communities when using this original content. It also gets, though, to who we empower in this space and who we support in it, and having a growing source of diversity. It gets at which stories we're telling and which incidents we're investigating, what parts of the world we're looking at, and what becomes invisible when we don't actually use these particular methods, what particularly lends itself to digital transmission of facts, and what doesn't. The last part I would mention on the dignity side is who do we make vulnerable by our work? I think we need more of a risk assessment of that at the outset of each of these investigations, or if we're doing it for research, as part of our research plan. And we need to be realizing that we have extraordinary power in this space that is amplified by these technologies. And maybe we shouldn't always be the right ones to be doing this, or we need to be thinking about new ways to put basic protections in place. And I'll just close with saying, if facts are ultimately the currency for the work that we're doing today, that currency is being devalued at the moment. And we need to be thinking aggressively about how we start to rebuild that currency and strengthen it so that we can do the work we know has to be done. Arguably, one way to begin to strengthen that and build it up is to lay an ethical foundation underneath it. And with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions or your thoughts or concerns on this particular topic. Thank you. So any questions?
Come on, questions.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation. My name is Cordelia. I'm a student at University of Oxford, studying Russia and Eastern Europe. My question would be about the growing differences in data protection between the United States and Europe, specifically the EU, and how one or both of you would see this affecting transatlantic cooperation where this data is concerned, and how this data is then used in open source research. Thank you.
Great. So that's been a big issue that we've had a lot of conversations about, particularly in the areas where we're working for legal accountability. I think the growing kind of impression is that the EU standards that are being set are really setting standards for the field and are shaping our understanding. So even in jurisdictions that are not necessarily bound by those provisions, like the United States, we know that a lot of the companies are beginning to design their work and are thinking about the most stringent forms of protection. I do think it's creating as we're working on our international protocol, one of the things that we're building into that is a data minimization principle. So thinking through when you're doing information collection, you need to have enough information to do your job, but you really almost need to game it out to figure out what are the boundaries of that and try and work. I think even 2 years ago, there was a real move towards scraping large quantities of information. And I think that's increasingly being recognized as a problematic practice, and that there needs to be really careful deployment of that, particularly when you are looking in legal contexts where you may have disclosure obligations, et cetera. But that said, there's also a principle whereby you want to be thinking about the future. And I do do think this is where the open source community has a really important role to play to preserve information that is going to be lost. I think particularly in a very shifting and very dynamic environment where the methods of access are changing rapidly and the kinds of content that platforms are tolerating for disparate reasons is becoming a little bit narrower. I think we need to be thinking about that issue. One area where I do think ethics helps is I think that as an investigator, we've really been trying to increase the ways that we get access to underlying information. But unfortunately, there's so many competing principles in the space where the platforms, I think if we look at New Zealand and Christchurch and what happened relatively recently, there's the physical harms that happen when people incite violence on platforms or they share violent content. But I think there's also the psychological challenge that happens, and I think in the New Zealand context, we saw several suicides after that they were allegedly causally linked to having viewed the content that was shared online. So I think that does begin to get at what should we be sharing, what set of norms should we be adopting, and it's a little bit of a gray area.
I mean, I think there's not much I can add there except the reason you would need ethical guidelines is when these things aren't black and white. There's tensions between the choices that we make on preserving privacy, capturing data. There's tensions there. There's tensions for the platforms about providing access to their data versus kind of keeping it protecting privacy, but keeping it close at hand. And I think there's tensions there that we have to navigate. I think there's opportunity for conversations about what are best practices in these places and how do we best navigate some of these tensions. And sometimes people will make different kinds of choices, and perhaps there is some gray area that different kinds of choices for different kinds of professions or how we're approaching the problems. But I do think we want to know the boundaries of what the choices that are acceptable to the community. I think it'll be really important as we move forward.
Piggyback on that, there's a question on the board that says, as we try to build towards standards, who should host them and how should they be enforced? And that's something we've really been grappling with, because who are we at Berkeley to be designing a set of standards in this space, either on the ethics side, even if it's in partnership with other universities and organizations, or on the legal accountability side. I think the really klutzy way we've tried to grapple with it as best we can is to try and make the building of the international protocol at least as inclusive as possible, so give people a chance to weigh in on it. We have an editorial board of about 15 different people who've worked in different international tribunals, but then have done over 150 consultations with different individuals and groups. And I think that needs to be scaled up tremendously. We also need to test the applicability of some of those standards to different regions and different areas of practice. In our case, we're lucky in that it's a little bit more focused on finding facts and verifying facts for legal accountability. So it begins to narrow down some of the potential conflict and debate in this space. On the ethics side, I really think there is a challenge there in speaking across different fields of practice where a lot of us don't speak the same language. And a lot of times there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen just to get us at a base level of understanding each other and the dictates that we have through our own professional ethical codes, and how those can sometimes be in tension with a growing understanding of what it means to work with open source.
Oh no, our questions disappeared.
And maybe we're out of time. Yes.
Hi there. Harry Holcroft. I'm with M&C Saatchi World Services. I sit on two sides of the fence because I also used to be at ISD. And it's sort of, my question piggybacks off one of them that you had on the screen, which is around the question of disadvantage. And this question could have equally been for Andy and Ben, and it's basically around the question of mitigation. And is mitigation actually fighting a battle in a war of ideas that we're losing and where we're constantly on the defensive? And I think the key thing for us is, rather than looking at the analysis and the capturing of data, it still becomes a question of mitigation. Do you think that we can have the same basis for values as a community when actually, in some forms, not offensive action needs to be taken, but we need to be putting out content and putting out and repeating the truth, as opposed to necessarily just mitigating for what's there?
I agree. I think there's a moment right now we're all kind of back on our heels. Not we're all, but many of us are back on our heels. It feels like we were not anticipating what happened in the sort of information space, and now we're sort of gathering and kind of figuring out what are we going to do. And I think the term mitigation in some ways is correct, but I do think there needs to be more about actively building trust. Actively building trust in this information space. If the attack is one on the integrity of the information space, constantly being on our heels and mitigating is not. We're going to give ground. I don't think we're going to win. I do think there has to be something kind of a forward-looking building of trust. I think this is part of building of trust, but I think building of trust is also generating content and other kinds of things. But we do have to be very careful. From those of us studying disinformation, that we don't use tactics that further undermine trust in the information spaces. So if you're going to create content, that you're not running disinformation operations and using sock puppet accounts and doing the same things that we criticize in others. I think it's very important that we come up with sort of, these are the kind of standards we're going to hold ourselves to, because by overstepping them, we're actually contributing to the problem that we're trying to solve.
And I think that's a big piece of it, just to piggyback really quickly, is better identifying the range of risks that come with this area of practice. I think we all have a very narrow perception of it based on what we do day to day, but I think by talking together and across areas of professions, we can ultimately begin to understand how the work that we're doing impacts other people and be a little bit more thoughtful in how we design our investigations plans. All right.
What do we do if you've got someone who's a digital Sherlock who might be operating in a very dangerous space and is forced to use techniques that might be seen as morally grey or something that's against your code of conduct, i.e. they're using accounts that they aren't using publicly, they're kind of operating under the radar, and they're actually doing it for their own safety. But if they contravene a moral code, where would they stand overall in it? Because if they're actually staying under the radar for their own safety, what do we do then?
So I think that's so context specific, and it's really important to be aware of the context in which you reside. With law enforcement, they may have the authority to use sock puppets, and there's a lot of obvious work that goes into it, just to use one example. But if a layperson starts using sock puppets and ultimately infiltrates a criminal network, they can be held to the same level of responsibility as that criminal network if ultimately that's revealed. And I think sometimes the legal ramifications are underappreciated. So I think part of the time it's knowing who else might be better situated to do the kind of activity that needs to be done and seeing if there's smart partnerships that can be created. Same thing with more and more journalists having their work feed into legal process. I think that really, you don't want to be practicing law without a license. I think it becomes really important to think through, are there networks of relationships within this community, the open source community, that can support and or piggyback on it. You know, everyone's going to have to make those decisions for themselves. I think also, too, it's an awareness of who are you endangering with this, and are you willing to take on those risks. I know in the human rights community, for a long time, there was an ethos that if people are suffering on the ground in war zones or in areas of atrocity, who are we as outsiders not to come in and take those baseline risks? But oftentimes, as someone from the global north going into an area in the global south that's been hit by conflict, the people I am putting at risk is not myself. It's actually the people who are supporting me, either as fixers or translators, et cetera, as I think many of us know. So I do think there's more work that needs to be done on understanding the digital space and how those kinds of situations play out here.
And I mean, I agree. There's a great need for some people that are acting in certain spaces to remain anonymous, and I think there's like these ethical gray areas where sometimes that's what they need to do. I think there's a value for those of us who can to use our own names and not to be anonymous. There's a value there, but I would absolutely not say that everyone had to have their own identity in order to function in these spaces. In fact, we had an argument about that last night. I don't think that's necessarily, not an argument, discussion. I don't think that's necessarily, you know, a restriction that we need to hold ourselves to, because I think it's important, and there are great actors out there that are doing important things that are not, we don't necessarily always know their identity.
Thanking Kate and Alexa. Thank you so much.